Welcome dear students to the next part of our video where we are discussing the chapter A Triumph of Surgery by James Herriot. So dear children, as we started the reading of the chapter, we could see that there were three characters in the story. One was Mr. Herriot, who was a veterinary surgeon or a veterinary doctor. Second was Mrs. Pumphrey. And third was the dog Tricky, who is the main character of the story, around whom the whole story is knit. And who is Mrs. Pumphrey? Mrs. Pumphrey is Tricky's rich mistress. Now, in the first part of the video, we read about Tricky, who was too pampered as well as overfed by his mistress. And Mr. Herriot had already advised him not to give him lot of food as well as provide him healthy food and make him exercise. But Mrs. Pumphrey did the complete opposite of it. She overfed the dog and in turn the dog had become fat and went on to become fatter with each day and looked just like a sausage with 4 limbs attached to it. Mrs. Pumphrey did not make him exercise also, and for that she gave a reason that she took him along with her for little walks. But since Hodgkin, the gardener, was unwell due to back pain, therefore he had not been throwing rings at him, and thus his exercise of catching the rings and running here and there was postponed for some point of time. When Mr. Herriot was shocked to see Tricky's condition, he could not control himself. And he says, I tried to sound severe. Now, I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Herriot. I am sure you are right. But it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off head down along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. Now, what happened? That the narrator tried to talk seriously to Mrs. Pumphrey. Who is the narrator? The veterinary doctor, Mr. Herriot. And he talked to Mrs. Pumphrey that if she did not control Tricky's eating habits and increased his exercise, he would soon fall ill. He told her that she should stay strong and strict with him and put him on a diet. Mrs. Pumphrey accepted that, although she knew that Mr. Herriot was right and she was wrong in overfeeding the dog. But it was too difficult for her to refuse him for anything, and on the other hand, it was also difficult for her, to cut down Tricky's food. And she left the place as if she was now ready to follow the new regime or the new routine properly. Mr. Herriot was watching them go and looking at Tricky walking unsteadily. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. Now the narrator Mr. Harriet was watching them go and looking at Tricky walking unsteadily. We can see that how Mr. Harriet says that Tricky was tottering. That is, the dog Tricky, due to its weight and lot of fat, was unable to move in a confident manner and freely. Therefore, the dog was moving in a feeble or a weak, unsteady manner. And what do you understand by a tweed coat? A tweed coat is a coat made out of a rough surfaced woolen cloth. And here we can see that the dog was so pampered that the dog had a wardrobe, means a large tall cupboard which had several clothes hung or stored in it, and according to different weather, like for the cold weather, for the wet days and all. But the dog struggled on drooping in his harness. The dog felt a lot of trouble in walking and seemed to be hanging down from the set of straps and fittings, which is the harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. And at that moment, Mr. Harriet understood that soon Mrs. Pumphrey would be calling him and that Tricky would be in a worse condition or would be soon found unwell because of the growing weight, which could be eventually seen while Tricky was walking on the road, and the doctor could find it easily that Tricky was not at all comfortable and was not at all well. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Distraught was very worried. Mrs. Pumphrey's call came immediately after just a few days, and Mrs. Pumphrey sounded quite worried and upset. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. What happened? That Tricky was not eating food, and even the most favorite things that he savored or enjoyed a lot. And he had bouts of vomiting, that he had rounds of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting. With a heavy breath, the dog remained on a rug or a floor covering or a mat, we can say. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. The poor lady almost swooned. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay. Followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. So, children, what happened? That as expected, Mr. Harriet got a call from Mrs. Pumphrey, and she seemed to be really worried and upset about Tricky's ailing condition, as the dog was not eating anything, not even his favorite dishes, and vomiting frequently. He didn't even want to do anything. Now, being a veterinary doctor, the narrator knew it very well that Tricky was not at all well, and in order to cure Tricky, it was really required to take him out of Mrs. Pumphrey's house for a few days. He even suggested Mrs. Pumphrey that it would be really beneficial for Tricky if she hospitalized him and kept him under observation for 15 days. On hearing this, Mrs. Pumphrey was about to faint. She was sure she was swooning, that she was about to faint and go unconscious on hearing that the doctor suggested to keep Tricky away from her for at least 15 days. She was sure that if Tricky did not see her every day, he would surely die. But the narrator knew that it was the only way and only option to take Tricky out of Mrs. Pumphrey's home and from Mrs. Pumphrey's over care. The narrator thought it would best be to avoid any delays and get him to the hospital as soon as possible. He went to their house, and even though Mrs. Pumphrey was crying because she did not want her dog to go away from her, he wrapped the dog in a blanket, took him away, put him in the car, and ran away from Mrs. Pumphrey's household.